This is meant to be an interactive discussion. We have a lot to share with you today, but I want to encourage you to raise your hand, ask for clarifying questions if you want as we go along, and we will do our best to answer. We also have, well, I'll let Chief introduce Detective Marcos.
Okay.
Deputy Chief.
We have with us Detective.
I did that to you.
Deputy Chief Scott Marcos. He's kind of our resident criminologist, has a background in studies into these plans and things like that, and he'll be able to answer some of the questions more in depth as we get into the presentation.
So we're presenting to you today the third iteration of the city's crime control plan, which, if you recall, some of you were in the room back in January of 21 when we released the first version of the city's crime control plan. And it was in response to the situation unfolding across the United States in not only capital cities like ours, but a lot of medium-sized cities and centers for business and economy that were experiencing the incredible economic fallout and the human casualties and the impact from the COVID-19 pandemic. Coupling that time of the world also with a rise in a social movement after the murder of George Floyd, with the increase in domestic violence, with concentration of more families, I think, being at home together longer, and a strange and terrible, tragic preponderance of violent crime increases across the country, coupled with the staffing shortages that were impacting and actually have continued to impact some cities across the country when it comes to police force. Salt Lake City, like many of our sister cities, capital cities across the country, and even in parts of our own state of Utah and like the Department of Public Safety and other departments, saw a peak low of 92 officers who had 92 vacancies rather in our total department. And we saw an increase in violent crime and property crime, coupled with the uniqueness of the world settings and our local settings, along with the decrease in police numbers. So that's where the original crime control plan was based and rooted, and it was a strategy for us to stop what felt like a hemorrhage happening in terms of vacancies in the department and a spike in overall crime, specifically violent crime. That crime control plan we always knew would be iterative. We started out with the partnership with the U.S. Marshal, U.S. Attorney, the DEA, AFT, that's the ATF. Alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives as well, and our own State Department of Public Safety. And that was around focusing on felons who were not receiving enough jail time. Sometimes we had, on too common an occurrence, we'd have our officers book someone in the county jail for a felony, a pretty high-level community impact felony, and they would be back out on the street sometimes within their very same shift that day. So we partnered with these federal partners in our very first version of the crime control plan to form Project Safe Neighborhoods, and we've been reporting with you in the about 2 years since about the incredible number of people who are behind bars now awaiting federal trial, over 200 people, and hundreds of firearms taken off the street from people who shouldn't have had them in the first place, which made them available to this Project Safe Neighborhoods. Then in October, actually November of 2021, we issued a second version of the crime control plan, and that put a number of strategies in place around hiring and retention, around call diversion, trying to improve our call response time numbers, which of course are impacted, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. Those are impacted not only by the number of officers available, but the process of dispatching, what actually gets assigned to an officer versus some strategies that we began to implement in the second version around call diversion. So are there officers who aren't able, they're recovering from an injury, they're on leave for one reason or another from being in the patrol car, but could answer the call over the phone and take it telephonically, for example. And you can go back to the November 21 version of the crime control plan. But there were four main goals around lowering crime, improving our response times, getting to the appropriate staffing levels by filling the number of funded and unfunded positions, sworn positions that were in the department's budget, and then continuing to build community relationships. So those 4 pillars guided the strategies in the November 21 plan. And today, we're here to update you on our October 22 third approach of the crime control plan, which again will continue to be iterative because the needs of this capital city are dynamic, they're ever changing, and our desire to evolve and serve and meet those needs continues with that momentum. Chief is going to walk us through most of this. I'll of course be giving some commentary along the way, but the goals here are still focused on reducing violent crime and overall crime in the city. We have some great data to show the reductions that have taken place. But what you'll also see, and the reason that Deputy Chief Mortgos is joining us today, is that we have a more focused approach on the short-term, medium, and long-term for reducing violent crime in this city. And it's a strategy that we have already begun to implement. We're here today to share with you some of the outcomes of this early implementation and what our strategy looks like going forward. But before I hand it over to Chief Brown, I want to say that with the decrease in violent crime, the decrease in overall crime, decrease in property crime that the data show, this by no means is meant to diminish or undervalue the real crime that is taking place in our capital city and the very deleterious and personal effects that it has on anyone who experiences that crime that happens on a day-to-day basis in the city. We will never be done working on new strategies to improve lives and divert, stop, and prevent crime in the city. And that's what this crime control plan is all about. But I just need our residents to know that although we will be sharing numbers showing really positive improvement on crime data in the city, that in no way do we mean to degrade or dismiss the experience of the actual crime that's happening on our residents. Chief Brown, do you want to walk us through the October 22 release?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thank you for being here. The Mayor is absolutely right. The reason we're on our third iteration of the crime control plan is because crime is never static. Policing is ever evolving. We have to be fluid, we have to change to meet the needs of our community that we serve. We have seen some great success with part 1, part 2. But part 3 and some of the things that we roll out today and talk about are going to really change the dynamics of what we're doing and the impact it's having on our community. So if you want to go back and look at what's happened over the last year in our CompStat data, we have seen since January 1st of 2022 to October 2nd of 2022, we have seen violent crime a reduction of 4.5%. Property crime is down 10%. Total crime is down 9% in Salt Lake City. That's fantastic, but there is more work to be done. If you look at the slide up here, you can see in 2022 year-to-date, we had 12,835 victims of crime or crimes. This year, we've had 11,632. That's a difference of 1,203, but that's just a number. If you put a face to that, that's somebody's mother, somebody's father, their brother, their sister. Those are victims, and so we can never lose sight of that. If crime happens to you, your crime is up 100%, and that's the focus. Is we've done great work, and we have more to do, but we can never look past that. These are victims of crime that are impacted by these things here. Want to touch on that one, Mayor?
Sure. So while we've seen our violent crime come down 4.5%, overall crime is down 9%, and property crime is down 10%, the calls for service to this department are growing dramatically. January 1 through the beginning of this month, we received 96,000 calls for service last year. I'm sorry, the same dates, January to October 2nd, 96,000 calls approximately last year. This year, 104,000 calls for service. That's a increase of about 8.5%. But when we look at that yellow bar at the bottom there, or it's pink to you, just in that 1 week, the most recent set of data we can pull from September 26th to October 2nd, over 100% increase in the calls for service coming in through 911 for Salt Lake City Police Department. They're not all the same types of calls. Chief, will you talk about the increase in what type of calls are entailed there?
I will. And just to put a little bit of a finer point on that, the difference in calls for service, 2022 to 2021, is 8,085 calls for service. That averages 207 calls per week that our officers are going on. So if you look, our officers this September compared to last September, that 1 week we are going on twice as many calls this year. So the calls for service, for whatever reason, through the pandemic and the recent years, have just escalated. Some of the calls for service that we're seeing, although some are violent crime, there's a lot of calls for service on property crimes. There's a lot of calls for mental health issues and things like that. That's why we have diversified our portfolio and the things that we do here at the Salt Lake City Police Department. We have our social workers, we have our CIT teams. We're looking forward and strategizing on better ways that we can serve this community, because the calls for service, when somebody calls the police, they expect somebody to come. And we want to get there as soon as possible. Better yet, we'd love to prevent crime from happening, but we want to get to these calls as fast as we can, whatever they may be.
So in order to respond to the calls, we need to have the people to respond. And when we hit that low of 92 vacancies, we put, as part of our strategy that fall, into place retention and recruitment strategies. A lot of them worked. Some of them didn't work as well. One of those that didn't work as well is the $5,000 lateral hiring bonus that we put on the table. At the same time, as I mentioned, a lot of departments were looking at some extreme vacancies in their departments. And given the competition in the marketplace, even in the region here, we only ended up recruiting, I think, 4 lateral officers with those bonuses. But good thing, we still were able to run recruit classes of about 20 officers. We recognize as a department with a growing capital city, we're in our 14th year of growth here, not all the same types of growth, but from a population perspective, we likely need more training facilities, and this is on the horizon for future plans for us. But in the meantime, we are running classes through as much as we can. And it takes time to recruit and train the best officers to work in the Salt Lake City Police Department. If we go, maybe I have.
Yeah, it's a different chart here.
Okay.
You're good. All right, so look, staffing has been an issue. It's not just an issue here in Salt Lake City. It's an issue here in the state of Utah. It's an issue across the country. I happen to be a member, or this department is a member of the Major City Chiefs Association. And I recently attended a conference where I'm listening and talking to peers, different chiefs from these different organizations. Although we're down 41, there are agencies across this country that are down 100 to 500 officers. It's not just here in Salt Lake City, but we have done great work and made great strides in hiring our officers. Right now, we have 41 vacancies, but our PD is growing. We added an additional 10 officers to our violent crime apprehension team. Those will be officers that are trained and utilized to go after the most hardened and violent criminals in our communities. We also are adding another 12 sworn positions to the department for our homeless resource centers, so they'll be coming online as well. So the department's growing, the city's growing. We're looking at ways, we're looking at a strategic plan so that our department can meet the growth of this city and meet the growth of our communities.
Those positions have been added and filled, or is that now on top of the 41 vacant?
No, those include the 41.
Includes?
Yeah.
And just the context here, you'll see this in the full version of the crime control plan, but cities across the country are offering, some of them $30,000 to $40,000 hiring bonuses for lateral hires. This is departments taking officers from one department and hiring them into another, basically. How sweet can they sweeten the pot? And that $30,000 to $40,000 competition. Some are offering $5,000. In our experience, $5,000 didn't go that far, but the hiring challenges are actually, I think, far worse in other parts of the country. And you'll see that in part when we talk in a moment about our call response time improvement that we've seen.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide, please. This graph here shows it's a 77-month trend line of officers that have left the department. If you go back to July of 2016, you can see that we lost 2 officers. Either they retired or they were separated from the department. You can then see that that timeline kind of ebbs and flows, but you can see some huge spikes in August of 2020, October of 2020, and then it drops down. But again, in June of 2021, we lost 19 officers. So you can see by month that we lost quite a few officers during those years of 2020 and 2021. But you can then see, through all the efforts that we've been doing here, the hiring, the classes, everything that we've worked so hard to do, that the mayor supported us on, we have bent that curve, and we're back down to October of 22. You can see that we're down to 2 officers that are one's going to retire 1st of November, and I think one is retiring this month. So that's a good curve to look at. That means we are getting things right here in Salt Lake City in this PD.
And I'll make a note on the July 21 spike that you see there, that shortly after that was when the city finally reconciled what was a 30% pay gap for our starting officers with with the highest paying department in the state of Utah. We hadn't given a significant pay increase to our officers since the Didi Corradini administration some 30 years ago in the city. We had done incremental investments in their pay and salary, and it was completely insufficient. So just shortly after that, the city council and I worked to approve and get through that pay increase, and it was not only for starting employees, it made adjustments at the top out end as well. Most of you covered and reported on that. But the part that you don't see on here is what I think is the morale improvements in the department. You know that as a city we faced, and our police department helped to handle about 300 protest events between May 30th and the date of the insurrection. Those meant overtime shifts. Those meant officers missing out on their kid's first football game and their wife's doctor's appointments, and really important things that you can't measure and you can't necessarily create a strategy for that ends up on a chart like this, except to make the department whole again and let our officers know how much we need them, we appreciate them, we rely on them, and we want them to be well. So there's been many more strategies around improving those conversations and the morale and the relationship with our officers. And I hope that the numbers are also reflective of that without those strategies being in writing.
And to the mayor's point, we've now had 15 officers rehire back with Salt Lake City. I remember sitting down and talking with some of the officers that had decided to either retire, leave law enforcement, and go to other organizations or other departments. But we've had 15 officers come back, which means this is a great department. It's always been a great department, but it's very good to have them back and with their enthusiasm and to bolster our numbers. We also have just hired, kind of something exciting and new, a new recruiter through the Human Resource Department for the Salt Lake City Police Department. So this recruiter will help us look for strategies and different areas that we can recruit from, not only locally, but across the country.
And we, as I mentioned, we're running classes at the fastest clip we can and with the best and most qualified officers we can recruit. But even looking down the timeline of how long it takes to go through those classes, we want more lateral officers to help us fill that gap faster. And so we're exploring ways, and I mentioned the $30,000 to $40,000 signing bonus concept that's in other parts of the country right now, with our $5,000 being quite a bit lower than that. we'll be exploring and inviting our city council to work with us on exploring different recruitment and also retention opportunities that we can build into our training classes we're running through. And then the last point I want to mention is that on this slide, that with our growing population, the state is the fastest growing population in the nation. We have the strongest economy in the nation and here in Utah by many, many measures. There are dynamic needs in a capital city like ours. And from the international airport that we host, the Research One universities, the hub of government, economy, finance, arts and culture in the state of Utah, and great entertainment resources like the Vivint Arena and our ballpark and everything else that brings people downtown, we need to fine-tune what the actual staffing needs are for this department. And this has happened occasionally over the course of the department's history, but we will be working with the right national teams to help us get an even better sense of what kind of staffing levels we need. It's not just the 41 vacancies that we're looking to fill right now, but we want to ask those hard questions about what shape and form of department and divisions do we need to meet the evolving needs of our city. So that's a piece of work that we'll be undertaking.
So I think what we're saying is police officers matter, and they make a big difference to our community that we serve. And if you look to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about response times. And this is kind of the report card of what we've been able to accomplish over the last few months. We have instituted mandatory overtime. So we have officers across the department, detectives, SWAT, gangs, whatever they may be, they're coming back and doing mandatory overtime here within the police department in patrol. They're chasing those calls for service. We're doing 18 mandatory overtime calls per month. Or, I'm sorry, per day. That's a lot of overtime. That's a lot of officers on the street answering those calls for service. And the report card up there speaks for itself. If you look, September of 2022, for priority 1 calls, the time was 10:24. For priority 2s, it was 15:38, 42:10 for 3s. On average, our response time was 29:08. Now, compare that to a year ago, September 2021. Priority 1s are down 3 minutes and 56 seconds. Priority 2s, our response is 8 minutes and 35 seconds faster. Priority 3s, 58 minutes and 27 seconds faster, for an average response of 33:28 faster than we did last year. That is a huge move of the needle. And I have to say, and I will continually always give credit to the officers that are out there handling these calls for service, going call to call to call, doing the very best job for the communities they serve. They're doing a fantastic job.
I want to just phrase this another way. So even though we know we're down just over 40 officers right now, the level of service that Salt Lakers are receiving is not a 42, 41 officer deficit of service. Because we're running 18 overtime shifts every 24 hours, we are basically backloading, and we're able to up and increase our level of service, trying to bridge this gap of the 40-some officer deficit that we have right now. It's not sustainable. Running mandatory overtime shifts is not a long-term strategy, but it will help us get to the point where we bring on those future recruiting classes that you saw on the last slide with the blue box that shows the class numbers and when they'll be graduating. And hopefully, in the meantime, we'll be able to implement some better lateral recruit strategies so that we get there even faster. Response times, they vary across cities. It's not really necessarily apples to apples. We're a 110 square mile city. We have all the benefits and the challenges that I talked about a moment ago, from being the place of transportation, economy, culture, recreation for the center of the state and even the region. But a call time is made up of first coming into dispatch, and that dispatcher can take about 3 minutes to determine what's happening at a situation, whether police, fire, or combination is needed to respond. Perhaps the call can be diverted to an officer who's sitting at a desk, and we don't need to dispatch a patrol officer. And it can take a couple of minutes for the dispatch to determine who needs to be called up to that call. And then you have the fact that the officers are out somewhere in the 110 square miles of the city. And of course, it's dependent on how many officers are out there at that given time. So these dramatic decreases that we've seen year to date in the call response time takes all of those things into factor. And if you go back and look at our strategies from November of 21 on the call diversion tactics, I know Chief Brown, also Chief Lieb for the fire department have been working with our Salt Lake City 911, which is a separate department, to develop and implement these call diversion and better strategies to help reduce our call time. Good.
Very good. Any questions on that?
So Chief, what exactly does 18 overtime shifts every 24 hours mean? Does that mean that 18 of your sworn officers are, on any given day, are pulling an overtime shift?
Yeah, of 10 hours, Jed. That's a lot of time. So 18 10-hour shifts per day. Those officers are going back into patrol and answering those calls for service.
So does that mean officers are working on their off days? So
Yeah.
they're working an extra day?
Yeah, they're working an extra day.
How often does
Until
an
they're
officer do
required.
that?
What's that?
How often does each officer do that?
We asked them over the last 3 or 4 months. I think we had them sign up for 7 additional days. So that's the number it would take to run this overtime through, I think, the end of July, or end of December. I'm sorry, Mayor.
No, and there's also the finances of that. So
Yes.
you'll be seeing continued asks from my administration to our city council to fund these overtime shifts. And really, when it comes down to considering different tactics for recruitment of laterals, we are paying for not recruiting laterals today in the overtime shifts that we're running to bring down crime in the city and provide the level of service that our residents need. We're paying for it in overtime. Now, we can make a strategic decision, which is up to our council ultimately from a budget perspective, but we'll be working with them on whether or not we want to divert some overtime shifts and give our officers that relief to up and increase not only the recruit incentive package, but the retention part too, to make sure that we keep our great officers here with the city while we bring in new ones. So that's a decision I can't make on my own because I don't ultimately control the finances of the city, but I'll be having those conversations with this council.
But it's really a decision that we had to make here at the police department and talking with the mayor and her support, is this is the service that our communities deserve. Now, it is a burden for our officers to come in and to do that because it takes away from their days off, the different things they'll be missing. But it's the commitment of this police department to the communities that we serve. And it all rests on the backs of our officers that are going out 10 hours, day shift, afternoon shift, and graveyard shifts to answer these calls for service.
So they essentially work 4 10s, and when they work an extra, they're working 5 days a week, 5 10s.
Yep, exactly.
Any other questions on that?
Next slide. All right, one of the common themes you'll see through this Crime Control Plan 3 is strengthening communities, promoting safety, and expanding opportunities. That really is looking at things outside the box, looking at different ways that we can police our communities, being involved with our communities. The best partner we have in our community is the community members. We can't do this job without them. The Racial Equity and Police Commission, we went and talked to them and talked about community engagement and told them how important it was for this department. But given some of the resource issues that we were dealing with, we didn't have the staffing to do that. Well, they made it a priority, and they not only recommended a position, they recommended that it be funded and filled. We now have an officer who is dedicated full-time to community outreach. Since July of 2022, we have hosted 21 events. I mean, we're talking coffee with a cop, chill with a cop, pizza with the police, bike rodeos. There is not a bad way to engage with our community. And this officer is kind of the quarterback to kind of make those inroads and then bring the team so that we can better engage with our community.
Can we go to the next slide? You have, I hope with you now, the full crime control plan this is the updated version from the city. And we've just walked you through everything except the specifics around the violent crime approach. And violent crime has been the issue that has threaded through all 3 crime control plans, actually along with community engagement. And so right now, we've walked you through most of that, and we're about to get in now to the violent crime specifics. And there's an addendum, I hope you have this as well, which is the first time, and it's taken some time to develop, and I think it was absolutely worth it, but instead of, as in the January and November versions of the crime control plan of years past, that were immediate implementation, we now have not only an immediate implementation strategy, but a medium and a long-term strategy that's been proven out in other parts of the country. And we have some, as I said, some early data because we've been testing out these strategies in some hot spots in the city. Do you want me to go into this part? I can't.
I'll kind of set it up and then you can hear.
Okay.
All right. You've heard me talk several times in this very room about gun violence here in Salt Lake City. It's sad, but people are using gun violence as a form of conflict resolution, and it's got to stop. It's a plague that is affecting our country. It's a situation that's having an impact here in Salt Lake City. Nationally, gun sales have increased. In 2020 and 2021, more than 40 million guns surged into our communities. People bought guns by the millions. Now, with those guns coming into households, a lot of guns were stolen. A lot of guns were left in cars. A lot of guns ended up in hands of criminals, and sadly, in the hands of our youth. And I know we've spoken recently of the incidents that involved gun violence with our youth. It's tragic that this is happening, but we're doing a lot to change the narrative and to work hard on getting those guns out of the community.
We did the gun buyback program as one of our strategies from our most recent crime control plan before now. We recall had $50 or $100 cash cards. We were able to take 103 guns out of the community who voluntarily brought them here, and depending if they were an automatic weapon or not, they'd get $50 or $100. We will do that again this year. And the Project Safe Neighborhoods partnership with our federal partners that we mentioned at the beginning has taken, actually year to date, we've had 596 firearms booked into evidence just through Salt Lake City Police Department. 102 of those were from the gun buyback event. But we'll continue our partnership with the U.S. Attorney, U.S. Marshal, and those great federal partners. We're so grateful for Project Safe Neighborhoods. It is working at the felony level in helping people, helping justice, frankly, be rendered, and eliminating the opportunity by bringing people back into the communities before they're ready to. But as a parent and looking at even the recent incidents with a 14-year-old, 17-year-old, this is youth on youth violence with guns that's happening in our city, and it's not tragically unique to our city. This is something that we are addressing with the presence of officers, and this is part of the strategy that we're about to get into. These officers can describe it for you in police ways, but as the mayor, as a resident here, as a parent, violent crime is unique. It's usually not planned. It's a crime of passion. It happens in a moment, typically. And unlike a property crime where they may be staking out an area, looking at the vulnerability of a building or a person, a neighborhood, violent crime is one that actually police presence can prevent, not simply because they're there, it moves another block over. If something's going to happen, the presence of a police officer actually can prevent it entirely from happening. And violent crime is unique in that way compared to many of the other crimes that our officers deal with. So I'm getting ahead of ourselves here,
No, you're
but
good, you're good.
preventing violent crime is actually really about that. It's about preventing it entirely. It's not about moving where it happens because there's a police presence, the way you might see with a drug deal, and they'll find a more convenient spot to do it. Violent crime simply can be wholly eliminated by the presence of officers. That's what we're,
I have a question about that. When you're talking about police presence can prevent it entirely, how do you guys do that when you're down 41 officers?
It's coming.
that's what we're about to tell you.
Yeah, hold on to
Good
that
question.
thought. Good question. You know, and I will point out and just put a finer tip on what the mayor's saying. Look, our PSN, our Project Safe Neighborhood Partnership, has just been great for finding individuals that are willing to carry guns that shouldn't and actually cause this type of violence in our community. We have seized, since we started in 2021, January, 297 guns. 64 of those guns have been stolen. So we are taking guns off the street that are being used in crimes. As the police chief, I have to say, we've got to stop this gun violence. Guns cannot be a form of conflict resolution. Look, life is not a video game. You don't get to push reset and play on. Guns kill people. And it's my promise that we will bring criminals to justice, and we will bring justice to those who have been victimized. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about what you were getting at and what the mayor was kind of prefacing. We are looking at a strategic plan to reduce violent crime. Violent crime, when you research it, there are small geographical areas that account for about 5% of these small areas in any urban city account for about 50% of crime. That's an amazing statistic. And 5% of offenders account for the majority of violent crime. So we are looking at a strategy to take an effect on those areas and those offenders. And that is what we've been working hard with the University of Texas San Antonio. That is a strategy that we'll be implementing here in the Salt Lake City Police Department. When we talk about hotspots have been identified through our partners and through our analysts here on our team. We, through these overtimes, dispatch officers to hotspots. Go to this area, be present in this area during this time. We know that in these areas, there is a propensity for crime, a higher rate of crime, and so if we can put officers in those areas and those times, we are preventing a lot of this crime that is going forward. We have given our division commanders, each captain, there's 3 divisions here in Salt Lake City PD. There's the Pioneer Patrol Division, there's the Central Patrol Division, there's Liberty. Each captain has been given the charge to reduce crime in a focused area within the city, in their division. It's to be collaborative, it's to be place-based, offender-based, community-supported, but the biggest thing is to reduce crime. Those areas, the Pioneer Patrol Division focus area is from 200 north to South Temple and 700 west to 1000 west. The Central Patrol Division focus area is from 200 south to 400 south, 200 west to State Street. The Liberty Patrol Division focus area is from 13th south to 15th south, from 200 west to south to State Street. So small geographical areas in those divisions. These commanders have brought in all the resources of the department, the overtime officers, the mitigation officers, the narcotics, the vice, gangs. They have deployed them into these communities, into these areas, and they have done fantastic work. So here's the report card.
Let me just preface these numbers and reiterate that we are showing, as you saw at the top, a 4.5% decrease in violent crime in the city. And so to look at, as Chief said, the few areas that are the majority of violent crime offenses in the city and have targeted on those, to see 33% fewer violent crimes in the Pioneer Patrol Division, 28% in Central, and 71% fewer violent crimes in Liberty Patrol Division year to date from August of 21 to August of 22 are staggering reductions. We're very excited about how promising this strategy is already showing to be, and it's based again on the work that's happened. It began in San Antonio, but it's been implemented in other cities outside of Utah.
Yeah, I mean, we started in September, and then we've run it in for August and September. The September report out is Pioneer. When you look at property crimes, we're down 11. They had 11% fewer property crimes. The Central Patrol Division in their hotspot had 18% fewer property crimes, and the Liberty Patrol Division 11% property crimes. So it's having a huge impact. You know, I've been doing policing for 31 years now. This is the most strategic, most focused strategic plan I've ever seen. And it's based on data, and it's based on the science of criminology. This is a great plan. But it's a plan that involves officers, and it's a plan that involves our community. So none of this happens without the great officers, the women and men of the Salt Lake City Police Department, doing their job day in and day out, stepping up and taking those overtime shifts. And from the community members that we work with, for them being our eyes and ears and the best partners that we can have to reduce this type of crime. So I have to give a shout out to everything that they do for us, and especially the officers of this department. You ready? All right.
Should we make room?
Yeah, go on over, Bill. Here.
Good morning. The chief asked me just to kind of go over and describe in a little bit more detail the violent crime reduction strategy that we have been undertaking.
I know, I don't mean to embarrass you, but will you give them a little bit of background about why this is your specialty? You're not just a deputy chief.
So I'm a deputy chief here at the Salt Lake City Police Department. I'm over Field Ops 2, which encompasses Liberty Precinct as well as Central Precinct. I'm also over our data and crime analysis section for the agency as well. In my spare time, I am a PhD candidate up at the University of Utah, and most of my research and studies focus on the intersection of public policy and policing. So this is something I think about frequently, and I'm able to have a good network across the country with policing researchers as well as criminologists to be able to know what's the leading and cutting edge as far as strategies that police departments can take in order to reduce violence as well as other crimes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So as far as the strategy goes, so as the mayor and the chief alluded to, there's a short-term, medium-term, and long-term approach that we are taking here. And so the first one, well, and regardless of which time period we're looking at, it's all based off of this concept here that you see called the problem analysis triangle. It's also often referred to as the crime triangle. And essentially what it says is when you're thinking about crime and why crime is committed, it's because you have three things coming together in space and time. You have a motivated offender, you have a victim or a target, and you have a place where they come together that doesn't have a capable guardian. When you get those three things put together in time and space, that is when crime occurs. If you can strategically address or remove one of those prongs of the triangle, then you can keep that crime from occurring. Right, you can prevent that crime. And so all of these strategies we're talking about is really based off of that concept. How can we remove one of the legs of this crime triangle and be able to prevent a crime from occurring? And so you've heard the chief and the mayor talk a lot about hotspots. That is the short-term strategy that we're undertaking. And essentially what it is with our partners at University of Texas San Antonio, also with Doctors Rachel and Roberto Santos at Radford University, in concert with our own analysts here at the police department, we have analyzed over the past year what small number of areas within the city account for a disproportionate amount of violent street crime. So we're talking about homicides, robberies, and aggravated assaults. And just like any urban city you get, those type of violent street crimes are aggregated in a small number of areas. And so then we analyze that data and we look at what are the high crime times, what are the high crime days, and we specifically dispatch officers during those times and days to those areas to be a visible presence. And what we're trying to address there is take away that place without a capable guardian in this crime triangle. If we can be there as a capable guardian, as the mayor suggested, you can keep a violent crime from happening, right? And it's not like some property crimes or drug deals, if you will. They're not just going to go around the corner, meet at the flagpole to finish that fight. It just doesn't occur. And that's the whole concept behind hotspots policing. You kind of tamp down and put that hotspot out before it turns into a much larger fire, a larger problem. And this has some of the most robust evidence in crime and policing literature when it comes to what works, what can police do to affect crime. So we're about 30 days into this specific strategy. Every 60 to 90 days, we'll reassess what's going on in those hotspot areas. And if we have managed to put out the hotspot in a particular area, we will look for a new one that might have cropped up somewhere else in the city, and we'll address those at that time. So that's the short-term strategy that we're currently working on and we'll continue to move forward with. Next slide, thank you. As far as the medium-term strategy goes, we're looking at what's called problem-oriented place-based policing. And essentially what this comes down to is when you talk about hotspot policing, essentially at some point, you run out of officers to send to areas, right? That is a very resource-intensive, short-term strategy. It's not something we certainly can carry on in some regards in perpetuity, but not across the board. We cannot be everywhere at once. So again, analyzing where the most violent areas are in the city, then we want to start looking at this medium-term strategy and looking at what is it about this particular place that makes it conducive to violent crime. Right? And, you know, it depends whether it's a convenience store, whether it's an apartment building, whether it's some kind of business. You know, there's a host of different reasons why you find certain places are more conducive to violent crime than others. And you try to address those underlying issues in a problem-solving approach and hopefully have a long-term effect on that area where it no longer is conducive to violent crime. You know, an example of this recently in the Pioneer Division, there was a specific area that was had a high rate of violent crime compared to other places surrounding it. And one of the issues identified by the division commander out there was a lack of street lighting. It actually has been shown through different experiments, street lighting in and of itself can reduce crime that occurs during the nighttime hours. So the captain worked with the city because street lighting is outside of the police department's purview and was able to fix the street lighting problem there. So again, it's things like that where you're trying to get to the underlying issue to be able to affect long-term crime in those areas.
Can I address that,
Yes, please.
So that's not necessarily news to us that, you know, things that affect crime aren't all within the control of a police department. We've had the Community Action Team, which is an internal working group of city divisions that are out on the street, whether it's compliance, civil enforcement, PD, and other departments and divisions who come together and can talk about areas or properties that have a preponderance of issues happening. What is different about the way that we'll be convening this going forward is the empowerment to address the issues. So if that means street lighting, which is an expensive thing, very expensive thing, and Public Utilities oversees that, if the police department says this area is a priority for us, ultimately the Public Utilities have the direction over which areas are prioritized and ready for the next installation of street lights. We'll be bringing a new empowerment to these crime-based resolution directives that will be collaboratively arrived at with our different departments and divisions along with the police department, but guided by the data. And that's not something until we developed and had the research come to put our plan together with us of how we could coordinate around this. We haven't been guided by the data to bring the sense of urgency to those investments that may be outside of the police department's control. So that stakeholder internal working group, sort of the CAT team amplified, is a piece of this medium-term strategy going forward.
And then, Mayor, just to that point real quick, I think your support and your emphasis and your muscle behind this is going to really help, because I mean, I'm telling you, I have a lot of peers in the city, and there's a lot of directors, and they have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Public works, streets, and so if I go to them and say I need some street lights hung up here, it's like, well, you know, I'm really busy, and we can maybe get to that in a couple months. But Mayor, with your support and this being a priority, that can happen within days now, which is going to make a big difference.
Let me just be clear, streetlights can't happen within days, but we're going to work as fast as we can.
Okay. A week.
Question. So you guys are being addressing about infrastructure, streetlights, and more police presence in those hotspot areas. But also, you guys mentioned in your plan that you're going to improve the relationship with the community. How is that going?
Chief? I'm sorry, say it again real quick.
Maybe you should also talk about the type of police presence. Mm-hmm. He's talking about the confluence between, we talk about improving community relationship, but we're also talking about improving or increasing police presence in an area, and what is that?
You know, it's been very welcome. That's a great question. Look, I've actually gone out and done some of this overtime work. I've done some hotspot policing. It's these areas where we go are the people, the communities that live there, work there, they're very supportive of us. They appreciate us being there. So I would say it's been a win-win. We've been able to reduce crime, but I think it builds trust and relationships, and they really appreciate what we're doing to help drive down crime in their communities.
Well, and I'll just add to that, one of the beneficial outcomes of this particular strategy has been officers have been getting out of their cars and doing foot patrols in some cases, and they have an opportunity to speak with business owners as well as residents, having a lot of conversations that they might not have been able to have time before. So it's actually been very beneficial is what the feedback we're getting. Next slide. So the final part of the strategy is the long-term strategy, which is often referred to as a focused deterrence model. And essentially, what we're trying to do here is address the motivated offender portion of that crime triangle, where we aim to change behavior of high-risk offenders through a combination of deterrence, arrest, community involvement, and the provision of alternatives to violence. This is a long-term strategy in two senses. One, it is very resource intensive. It takes a lot to get it off the ground. And so it's not something that's going to be happening overnight. We're talking at least a year out. But it has been shown to be extremely effective in cities all over the country over a number of decades. And where essentially what it comes down to is again, the majority of violent crime is often committed by a small number of individuals. And rather than simply giving one option, which is incarceration, which is still an option, they're also given the opportunity to be provided a way out. And this is where it's become such resource intensive. You know, do you need help with job placement? Do you need help with drug treatment? Do you need some other type of social service or schooling, help getting your GED, whatever it is? And essentially, once they're identified, those individuals are identified, committing a disproportionate amount of violent crime, they're offered, like, we will come at you and with the full force of law enforcement as far as what the consequences are for that, or right here, right now, we have these other services available to you if you would rather take those, because we would rather you become a productive member of society than us have to incarcerate you. And so they're really kind of given that option. And hopefully they choose the pro-social option. But if they don't, then there's the other aspect of it as well. And again, having that choice available is what makes this such an effective strategy.
And key to this, obviously, talking about the police department not having all of the tools to do and create all of the solutions that we need. Key to this are our partners at the state, the county, where behavioral health services and where mental health services, all of that funding is focused. None of that is actually here in any of the cities in the state. And to this point, I don't want to go down a different path first, which is a separate press conference around our work together around homeless services specifically, separate subject, but that the relationship evidence there that you've seen of the state, the county, and the capital city working together, not only on a strategy, but on coordinated funding to do things like open the majority of more than 400 permanent supportive beds by the time the winter shelter closes, the creation of a winter shelter before the winter even comes on, and knowing those beds will be available. That's the kind of relationship that makes this long-term strategy even possible. Separate subject, not trying to conflate the two, but the relationship is one and the same. The state, the county, and the city working together so that there is not only the law enforcement resource option, but really the tools of what a human being needs to change their course in life if they decide to.
So that was a brief overview of the short-term, medium-term, and long-term approaches that we're taking as part of our strategic violent crime reduction plan. There is much more detail in the addendum that was authored with us as well as our partners at University of Texas San Antonio. So you can always refer to that for more information as well. And I'll turn it back over to the chief.
Well, just in closing, hope is not a strategy. This is a strategy. And we're excited about this. Thanks for the support, Mayor. And we'll be excited to report back to you in the next months and years going forward. But thank you for being here. Any questions?
You talked about, you see violent crime is down. but a lot of headlines lately are with youth violent crime.
Yeah.
Do you have any stats on what the youth violent crime is right now? Is that up, or is that when most of the violent crime is happening?
Pat, can I get back to you on that one? That's a good question. Let me do some research on that. But I mean, just from what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from the officers, it appears that there are more youth involved in violent crime. But let me get the numbers for you on that, okay?
When you talk about these resources that are available, is that helping the youth too? I mean,
Like the violent
what's
crime-
being done,
crime
maybe
team?
this is more of a city question than a police question, but prevent the 14-year-old from getting a gun in the first place? What's his
Yeah.
incentive if he's making a lot of money on the street, selling drugs and his gun?
You got it.
Sure, I'll give it a, you know that when it comes to the ability to obtain a weapon in this state, there's very little that any city can do. That's in the hands of the legislature to the almost complete extent. But when it comes to interrupting the violence, we've been looking at violence interrupter models that are happening in other cities, Baltimore, Chicago, other cities, that are really about individuals who have experience in the community and who likely often have backgrounds in criminal justice, who've served time. And they're not sworn officers and they don't work for the police department, but they're out there engaging with the youth. They know the neighborhood, they know the community, they're on the street, they're having those critical conversations and building trust with the youth. And that's a unique model that you're not seeing in the police presentation today, but it's something that my administration's working at. And I don't know,
And
Chief,
then,
if
Pat,
you want
just-
to add on that.
I mean, our
too.
SROs are invaluable to us. They work in the schools, they develop relationships with kids in the schools. You'd be surprised how many times we get information about somebody who may have a gun in a backpack, maybe they brought a gun, maybe it's in the car, but building those relationships with the youth through our SRO programs, our school resource officers, those are invaluable. And we would love to build that, to increase the number of SROs and to move not only from the high schools, but the junior highs and hopefully down into the elementary schools.
I got to add one more thing. The city council funded a full-time position for us to implement My Brother's Keeper. And that's a Obama initiative that's continued with the Obama Foundation out of Chicago, targeted at asking and working with the community and the youth themselves to identify and then address the barriers to success that young boys and men of color are experiencing in a city. And it was announced back, I think, in the Becker administration, and the city said, we love this, but ultimately nothing was produced out of it. We're finally doing that work. Also, it's in partnership with the United Way. So at a higher level, I believe that those are some of the issues that are coming up in the community conversations, and you may see some solutions coming through the My Brother's Keeper work.
Are you allowed to say where the hot spots are currently that you're focusing on?
No, not right now.
No, there will be a quarterly report generated with that particular part of the model, and so, I mean, at that time, we'd obviously be willing to talk about it, but at this point, it wouldn't be advantageous, one, to the officers responding at certain times of days for that. There's a safety issue there, as well as announcing where we're going to be and when.
Chief Mayor, what do you say to the businesses, individuals in areas where they feel they're seeing higher rates of crime and they don't feel it's getting better, or they don't feel heard? And a lot of them saying that I've spoken with personally, we're at our wits' end. We're looking at possibly moving at this point. What can you say to them today?
Well, I'll say that we feel your frustration, and as I said at the top, none of the good statistics we've shown you today is in any way meant to diminish the real impacts that businesses and residents are feeling with the real crime that happens here on a daily basis. So we feel your frustration, and it's part of what's driven us to evolve our crime control plan, go after grant dollars that helps us have a violent crime apprehension team, do work with our city council to get their support for the financial buy-in on these programs. I'm looking forward to our, for example, the Homeless Resource Center mitigation dollars that we finally received from the state, $2.7 million, that is hiring those additional 15 patrol officers for the Homeless Resource Center areas to help with the quality of life impacts outside of the resource centers, for example. That's the growth, that's what we're trying to do the lateral recruits for, but we're also running our training classes. We have to keep evolving to meet the needs, and I share their frustration, and it's part of what drives me.
And just to follow up on that, in the Crime Control Plan 2, there was a strategy to implement a business community liaison officer. That was an officer that their sole job was to go around and talk with businesses, work with businesses to fix problems. I mean, a lot of times in the past, they would call and we would send the next patrol officer. A lot of times they didn't have the historical information, all the data, everything they needed to do to fix the problem and work with them because they had to get to the next call. This officer now exists. He's doing great work with all our businesses. So it's a strategy that we can kind of check the box, but it's worked so well, we may look at expanding it.
We want to look at other areas for the Business Community Liaison Officer position, BCEO, like a CEO, but a BCEO. And I hope what you hear and see from us, but you'll hear it most from our officers, they want to do this work. They want to be there. They want to catch the criminals. They want to see people meet justice. They want our neighborhoods to be safe. I mean, that's why you see crime numbers going down. There's strategies at place, but most of all, there's great officers in this department who want to do the work. So it's not just me who's full of frustration and piss and vinegar about this. Our officers want to do the work. They want crime to go down. They want to be present. And I can say that for the officers across the department. We want that too.
You addressed this kind of in the beginning of the overtime shifts. Are you concerned that could amount to burnout within the department as we're still in dire need of filling vacant positions?
Absolutely, yeah. We know that overtime is not a sustainable model. You can't live on overtime forever, and I think that's what the mayor's talking about. We should really sit down and say, we're spending X amount of dollars on overtime. Why don't we use that money for maybe hiring bonuses, retention bonuses, and bring more officers in so that we don't burn our officers out?
And I think, you know, looking at the numbers, we're less than half the vacancies that we were at that low point. There's a chart that shows the month. In 2021, February of 2021 is when we hit that low point. We're going in the right direction. They see these classes coming on. They're helping with the field training officers. So I think that there's light at the end of the tunnel. We just need that tunnel to be shorter than it is with simply bringing in training new recruits. We need those laterals to come on board faster.
And do those take place every 6 weeks where we're putting
Training class.
the training?
Oh, the training classes, we try to hire three academies a year, new hires, lateral academies. Right now, we didn't talk about this, but right now there are 70 officers in some sort of academy or FTO program that are not on the street. So they're in academies, they're being trained. It just takes about 10 months to get them to the street. We'll see about 25, give or take a few, coming out in November. Another class that'll be graduating in March, but it's a continual process. But it takes, from hiring to the street is about a 10-month process.
Is it realistic to expect that you can eliminate the officer deficit?
I think in a department, and he'll answer this, but in a department the size of ours with about 500 sworn officers, there will always be people, retiring, taking a job somewhere else, burning out, entering a different field. And so I think that it's normal to expect a deficit of some number of officers, and that some number is actually not a known formula. There's different opinions about what the breakdown is, and of course then there's the demographics of any department. Some have a majority of younger officers, some have more seasoned. And so it's not always the same in predicting what the normal deficit is. It really depends on the makeup of the department itself. But
Yeah, Jed, we will. We absolutely will. We're sort of leaving no stone unturned when it comes to recruitment, laterals, correction officers, military. But one of the biggest recruitment pools for us is our Explorer program. We have youth, 14 to age 21, that come and they're part of our Explorer program. They're the most diverse by race and gender. And every class now, as they spent 5 or 6 years with us, as they approach 21, we're getting 4, 5, 6 of those explorers coming into our ranks, which is fantastic. But yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there.
Final question. This plan, you guys have updated this 3 times. If there's another update next year, what progress do you hope to see over the next year between now and the next time? you guys hit?
You can focus on the pillars set out in our objectives at the top of the plan. We want to see a fast call response time. We want to see the number of minutes for priority 1, 2, and 3 continue to come down. We want to see our recruitment and retention efforts, basically how many officers we have in the job, can that number continue to shrink as we become more and more fully staffed. We want to see crime numbers come down consistently. And we've been seeing that over the course of the last year. We need it to continue. And we know that it's not just saying out to the officers and the public, we're going to drive down crime. We actually have to put together this 56-page crime control plan and then put it all together again the next year because the city is changing. The needs are changing. But fortunately, researchers and smart people like Deputy Chief Morkos are reaching out nationally and saying, what's at the cutting edge here? What can we consider doing that makes good use of our resources but achieves our goals of reducing crime in the city, preventing violent crime in the city, reducing our call response time, and building a community that trusts, values, and wants the police department to succeed because they know that success is tied to their own. So community, call response time, number of officers, but overall crime reduction, violent property, and overall crime reduction is the key part.
Like your last question.
Yeah, Chief Brown, so last week the Pioneer Park Coalition released a plan, or more of a list of policies that it wanted to see change in how we address homelessness. And one of the biggest parts of that was a change in the way police patrol and a call for the so-called broken windows approach to policing, where by targeting lower level crime, you can ostensibly prevent the escalation of more serious offenses. So I was curious your thoughts on that approach to policing, whether you think it could be successful in Salt Lake City.
You know, that's a strategy that's been implemented for years and years and years. And it works. It's good if you pay attention to the small things. Sometimes they don't graduate into bigger things. But this strategy, when putting cops in areas where there is a propensity for crime, if you can prevent it, you don't have a broken window. So this one's actually, I think, a little more progressive, a little more forward-leaning, is to prevent the crime. Because every crime that we can prevent, and that's the hardest thing in any strategy, is to measure what you prevent. But this plan, with hot spots, focused areas, and then long-term, really looks at preventing crime.
Chief,
Thanks.
probably this is a question for another meeting, but you guys talking about reducing the violence in the city of Salt Lake. This is the main goal. Does that plan in any kind include the police? We have some concerns about some deaths in the hands of the police, and we want to know if you guys are improving that as well.
Improving.
What did you say? That you have some concerns about what? I couldn't hear you.
There is some deaths as a result of the use of the police force, and we want to know if that is included in this plan as well, trying to improve the protocols approaching the person who is being taken.
Do you mean use of force related
Yeah.
issues? Well, let me just mention, we've actually had a lot of conversations about this with the media, going back to the use of force reform that I put in place in August of 2020. It was trained on and you could see it out in the field by October of 2020. And our Commission on Racial Equity and Policing has been reviewing the city's PD policies, as well as some of the policies that are out of our hands around use of force and engaging with the public when those circumstances, trying to prevent those circumstances. So I encourage you to look at the Commission on Racial Equity and Policing with Salt Lake City. They've done a great deal of work. They've made recommendations, some of which were policy and some were financial, through our last 2 budget processes. All of their recommendations have been funded, and their policy recommendations have either been implemented or are in process now to be implemented. So great question, lots of research on that happening, but there's a couple years of evidence around it.
Thank you,
Is that good?
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.